Thank you very much to all of our panelists. I just want to say a few things before we open it up to the floor. It is clear, I think, from this discussion that inclusion is not a zero-sum game. It's not a black and white issue. There are, as Erin said, there are various forms of inclusion and exclusion. There are various levels of inclusion and exclusion. And it's the easiest way of saying it's not a zero-sum game. It is clear that even when women are playing football, even when they are fans, they are reproducing, they may be reproducing, and they might be included in spaces that reproduce normative gender ideals. And so the actual definition of fandom is not inclusive, or the actual definition of a footballer is not inclusive. The actual definition of what qualifies as a woman, as Erin said, or the definition of womanliness is not inclusive, right? So it is these kinds of definitions that need to be inclusive. It's not about including necessarily more women or more, let's say, more trans athletes. It's more about including within the definition of these categories other choices for people. So that, in fact, does parallel, I think, the first panel that we had on race, where Professor Carrington-Ben said it is insufficient but necessary. And we can turn that around and say it is necessary but insufficient, right? To have these people participate. It is necessary, but it's not sufficient, because even when they do participate, you see the reproduction, the recycling of some of the very same assumptions. So I'll leave it there and open it up to you all for questions and comments for our panelists. Yes, Nico.
A comment on Ithio's and Tamar's presentation. I wonder if you shouldn't be more attentive to the possibility that gender performances can be multi-layered. In other words, they can be ironic. I was just thinking of the makeup and high heels coming up, on the football pitch. Could be actually, and this is an idea that goes back a long way, even though it's usually attributed to Judy Butler, that people have an ironic relationship to, and what they may be doing by wearing high heels on the football pitch is precisely making fun of the stereotypes rather than trying to be more feminine, right? To please the crowds. And so, yeah.
I can respond to that. Like, when we interviewed them, so we were wondering about that too. Like, is this ironic? Is this a show? But all the, like, in the interviews show, they like specifically said, like, all these women, we are women. Like, even when we're in the pitch, like, we're women, and this has to be clear. We could be playing football here, but like, we're still women, and we have to stay feminine. So even one of them, like, who's also like involved with managing, she even said, like, we have to stay feminine, like underlying feminine many times, and we cannot become one of the members of the herd, she put it that way. Like, she's like, we have to be feminine here, like, and she was very proud. They had like these giant daisies on their jersey, and they were giving out daisies, and she's like, we have to do this, like making sure we're not one of them either men or those like woman men, like they don't want to be confused with.
Can I add something? My paper is based on Butler. So thank you. I didn't want to get into it today because I was warned not to get into theory. But if I understand Butler correctly and her analysis of transgender, she says it's a double-bind sword. On one hand, it challenges the system, the binary system, and on the other hand, it reproduces the binary system. That's how I understand Butler. Maybe I don't understand correctly. Moreover, if in my paper, I have several papers about, that's kind of the source of my lecture. I use I think a very important term, and this is passing. that I start in Goffman, I go to Butler, I go to what is his name? In Reis, Fanon, and so I give kind of chronology of passing. And when you look about, if you use this kind of concept to look at women, and I suggest men way of doing fandom, you get a huge variation, including ironic, satirical, that now is mainly used by the ultras, not by women. So I agree with you, totally. The question is how we bring into female or women fandom irony and whatever without more stereotyping them. Because the danger is that if with all these heels and whatever and lipstick, and that if they will do it ironically, they still will be more stereotyped than not. So I'm not saying it's a beautiful irony. I love, we have this in Judaism, Purim. You change all your body and all your. It's very interesting, but it's not always productive. So we have to see and to try, and that's what I think. You can come with masks. There are millions of things we can do. Women, and then all the change we put on women. They have to change their behavior. Men behavior is one model, and this will stay stable. And women will do all kind of experiments with their body and irony and whatever. So, no, I don't know, but I'm just playing in my answer.
Play with gender as well.
What?
Men play with gender as well.
Yeah, but not as much as women in the fandom field. When they are not sanctioned.
Go to the leather bar.
Where should I go? Where do you send me?
Leather gay bar.
Yeah, but that's gay bar. I'm talking about fandom.
She's using the universe of fandom as her lens.
Oh, okay, but she was making it.
No. I'm in fandom field. No.
Right. Well,
Professor Rappaport, I found your paper absolutely fascinating in conjunction with Professor Earhart's paper as well. I was just going to ask you about this. Your conception of fandom seems to be very much physically located within the space of the football stadium. What about fandom? When you take it out of that physical space into the space of the internet,
Thank you so
how
much.
do women talk about that then when they are removed from that, and how do they model their behavior?
Thank you very much for the question. I started to study fandom because I do anthropology, sociology of the body. I'm very interested in all this concept of practice.
Yes.
And I use this theory of practice in my observations about women and men. I didn't do any research on the internet. But I did research on behavior outside the stadium, because this, one of the questions that really kind of bothers me intellectually is why all these activities outside the stadium? It's a theoretical question. People are in the stadium, and they come, they see, why are they involved so much, like we heard from Barcelona and in all this doing good? I didn't find the kind of answer or whatever, but I think it's an interesting kind of question that we have to deal with expanding the stadium out and doing all kind of performances. There are many performances I saw on videos. Outside the stadium in Argentina, it starts in the morning, it finishes in the evening, all kind of irony, or all millions of things. So, but it's easier to study in the stadium, I admit. It's much more difficult to study outside. You can join outside games, which I did, but I didn't really look at performances outside the stadium. But it's always, for me, the same starting point is practice and anthropology of body. So that will be my answer.
I have a question for Aaron. Thank you for the great paper. And I was thinking about the fear. Now there's, for example, trans women playing the Brazilian volleyball league. fear that suddenly a lot of men are going to be turning into transgender women and going to take over the league. And I'm wondering, where does this fear come from? Is this fear of certain masculinity? Is this fear of certain,
Blurring the gender.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably a lot of people might have ideas about that. I'm suspicious of it as a genuine fear. I'm a lawyer, so I'm trained to spot pretext. And to me, I've always thought that that argument was just something to say so that you don't have to admit that it's really about bias and discomfort with people who are trans. However, I'm sure there's room for, I mean, I'm sure that's a partial explanation, and I'm sure there's room for others as well, like other more sociological explanations like you're wondering about. If anybody's got
I don't know
any
if it's
suggestions.
sociology, it's just common sense. I think the fear of blurring categories, there's a lot of, anthropologically, blurring categories. It's the ideal is a binary system. And once you start to blur the categories, women become men become women, etc., etc. I think it's genuine.
But that explains why people would be biased against transgender people.
Yeah.
But I don't know that necessarily explains why
Okay.
they would use that argument about, but men might dress up to be women, right? Which is, so there is a little bit of history on this. People are like, well, has that ever happened? And what about the, what about the East Germans, and what about the Russians in the Olympics? And there's a supposedly a documented case of an athlete who competed in the 1936 Olympics for Germany and was compelled by Hitler to dress as a woman in order to compete in women's one of the track and field, one of the field events. Didn't medal, by the way, just in case you're thinking that all men are better than all women. Some more recent history is actually looking back at that case and saying that actually might have been an intersex individual. So we're not even sure that that was truly a case of somebody masquerading as the opposite sex, as to somebody who was trying to do their best to fit their bodies into a world that uses categories that weren't made for that person. And then you could talk about sort of Cold War era shenanigans, but these are mostly like sort of doping kinds of things, right? You give an athlete exogenous testosterone, that's gonna make somebody masculine, but that's not the same thing as being trans. So there might be, I think, some of that history that people are thinking about, like, this is going to turn us into the communists, like that might be part of the anxiety.
So U.S. soccer is experimenting with a concept called biobanding.
Yeah.
Where they don't age. It is still non-binary, but I'm wondering if maybe it can be used to as a solution to this problem. Where they don't group kids by age level anymore. They give them a score, a scientific score. They analyze them scientifically on their maturity levels and their strength levels, and they group them by maturity level, by age level. It's called. So I'm wondering if that might be, a way to solve this problem, because it eradicates the binary.
Yeah, I mean, I think that having more options like that, where something other than sex is being used as the sorting mechanism. We're using sex because it's a rough proxy for ability. Why not actually measure ability, right? Now, there are reasons why not, right? Because when you do that, if you do that in a world where men have gotten a head start on athleticism, and then you say, we're sorting by ability, you're just sort of showcasing to the world that women are crappy athletes, right? We don't want that, right? We want to make sure that there's room for women in women's sports to thrive. But it's also been 50 years since we started to actually, in earnest, promote activities for women's sports. And it might be time to start experimenting with more liberal policies. And what better place than to do it at the earliest levels of sport, so that girls and boys can grow up, girls and boys and anyone can grow up learning that athleticism is not necessarily a function of your gender, that girls can be good athletes, that maybe not all boys are good athletes, and that those lessons might hopefully translate into more enlightened and thoughtful adults. Yeah.
response to the CAS ruling.
Yes, yes.
Which seems so clearly, given the lack of scientific evidence and the ambiguity of the scientific evidence, so clearly tied specifically to trying to prevent
So
caster
it-
Can you
Absolute-
explain
yes,
to
yes.
foreigners?
I will, yes.
Related to it briefly, it's fascinating to see how many men who have no interest in women's sports become concerned with protecting the category of women's sports. Could it actually be more a concern with the category of men's sports? In other words, the primary fear of men would be that actually that these women may come close to and begin to see men's performance. I just think of the example of Paula Radcliffe. The fastest time that a woman has ever run in a marathon isn't officially acknowledged because she happens to be running alongside men. So in other words, part of the fear isn't so much to protect women as a category for sporting achievement, it's the fear that sometime down the line these women might be better than us.
Yeah. Wow. I think your vision on that is like, yes, I will just, I'll fill in some of the backgrounds and add a little more. So Professor Carrington's referring to what's been ongoing litigation and controversy around the International Track and Field Association's effort to provide some kind of standard to govern their gender verification. So they abandoned the practice, along with other sports that participated in the Olympic family, of blanket testing, all female athletes having to pass some kind of gender test, because, as it turns out, there's not one way to determine someone's gender. Gender's just way too complicated for that. And so instead, sports have moved to a case-by-case basis, suspicion-based testing. If somebody's called out, we'll take them into our laboratory and we'll do some magic and we'll figure out if this person's really a woman. Well, that was getting the IAF into trouble, initially with Caster Semenya. So IAF said, okay, well, we better provide some kind of standard so that we can show the world exactly what it is that we're measuring for when we do the suspicion-based testing. So they came back with a standard that said, if the testosterone in your blood is 10 nanomoles, actually, that's where the International Olympic Committee got that number, 10 nanomoles that I had in my slide, that you're considered to have too high testosterone for a woman, and you'll be ineligible for women's sports unless you medically address that and suppress that testosterone and bring it down. And so that was challenged by an athlete named Dutee Chand, who's Indian, because she, on the basis of that policy, she was excluded from her event, and she actually won a temporary victory in the Court of Arbitration for Sport. She prevailed. She was able to run, and the International Track and Field Association had to go back and re-examine their policy and come up with a stronger scientific basis for it. So then this is what has happened recently. The IAAF comes back with a lower standard, 5 nanomoles per liter instead of 10, but a narrower focus. Only middle distance running, right? Only Caster Semenya, basically. It was it seems like there could be, it seems likely that there would be another round of challenge on this, and it would be up to CAS again to look at the strength of that scientific evidence and see what it's about. I think that there's no way to scientifically prove that testosterone, a particular testosterone level, is a source of athletic advantage. And I think that, frankly, even if there was, I'll even concede that, just for the sake of argument. It still doesn't explain why only testosterone is our concern, right? Why isn't there a rule that says, people with Michael Phelps-sized feet should not be allowed to swim? No, because if it's your natural ability, if it's your natural body, then it should be allowed. So I guess I've always been looking at it as this is just, over-policing of women's sport, but I appreciate having my mind open to the possibility this might be anxiety within and about men's sports, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we can take one last question before we wrap it up. Is there, there doesn't seem to be another question.
I want to ask smaller.
Okay, one final comment and then we have to wrap it up.
Hi, is there an evaluation? What is the percentage of people, within the category. Kind of I have no idea about the goal.
It's of the overall population, we're talking about a minuscule percentage. But when you're talking about elite athletes, that's actually going to be a noticeable percentage.
Okay. That was my question. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to our panelists, and thank you all.